Hi there everyone, I'm the guy with no gamertag and welcome to every Siege update. As ever, sources are listed down in the description, and today we're going to be covering changes starting from the release of Operation Black Ice. So on February 2nd we had this season's launch. This brought with it the operators Buck and Frost bringing their skeleton key and welcome mat gadgets respectively. It also introduced the yacht map to the game, and also being the first season, it introduced seasonal weapon skins to the game as well. Some of the important changes to this patch was they made operator shouts no longer audible to the enemy team. So for instance, when you were deploying a drone or deploying a gadget and your operator gives out a voice line, the other team used to be able to hear that. They also reduced bullet trail visibility, and this was especially for weapons equipped with suppressors. When the game launched, suppressors had very visible bullet trails like every other weapon, which meant that they were a very useless attachment because it reduced the damage and players could still work out where you are. So by doing this, it made this attachment more viable, and it also meant that players weren't giving away too much information by actually shooting at an enemy. They also doubled the range of flashbangs because flashbangs at this point were really inconsistent. They had very little range and you never knew whether the flash was actually going to blind someone or not, so they were rarely used because of this inconsistency. They also made it so that reinforcements and castle barricades would now block damage during deployment. Up until this stage, if you were partway through deploying a reinforcement and someone sprayed at the wall, you would get killed, so I'm glad personally that they made this change. They also made a few changes to the ranked playlist, the first of those being that defenders now have to rotate their objectives. Up until this point, defenders could choose one site over and over again, and so it meant that there was no variety because defenders were just going to choose the most viable objective location every time. So with this, once you've won an objective, you must choose a different site, which in my opinion is a really good change. They also made it so that the attackers can now select their individual spawn locations. Up until this point, it was a team vote and everyone would spawn in that location. Now attackers could spawn in wherever they wanted to. And they also changed the rank distributions. For the most part, this increased the ranks that people were given. This was because the distributions were completely wrong. The Platinum rank only had 0.1% of players in that rank, and that is completely wrong for what a normal distribution should be. I think it was 0.01% of players were in Diamond, so the actual distribution of players was completely wrong, so they thankfully fixed that in this patch. They also made mute jammers quieter, as well as electrified gadgets and Capcan's EDDs. They also gave Thatcher a shotgun. This was just so it would match up with his operator profile picture. They also made it so that Bandit's electricity would no longer damage the hostage. This was because attackers would pick up the hostage and drop it in an electrified wire and just get an easy win. That is some amusing ingenuity, but I can imagine it was very frustrating for Bandit players, especially with him being the only viable character to deny hard breaching in the game at this point. They also reduced the dust effect on screen when you're near explosions. For instance, when you're breaching through a wall, they just made it so you could see a little bit clearer. And a quick note I want to make just before I get into the bug fixes is that there are a lot of bugs in the game that have recurred in different patches. They've come back in different forms. So if that's the case where it's a very frequent bug recurring in lots of different patches, I will say that it's a first note of this and it's the first time they fixed it, and I won't be referring to those again in future patches unless it was a particularly infamous version of that bug. So to get into the bug fixes on this patch, the first one is that Thermite wasn't able to deploy on damaged and reinforced walls. This is a first note of this bug, so there's been many instances where he couldn't deploy on certain walls that he should have been able to, or it wasn't even destroying the walls properly. My personal favourite bug in this patch was that the attacking team would win a round of hostage if you team killed Fuse when he cluster charges the hostage. Like, that is some galaxy brain level thinking to even work that out and even find that bug. So I think that one's brilliant. They also fixed a bug where when you melee a shield it breaks their guard, but it wouldn't do that if the shield was moving, so that was a pretty annoying bug. They also fixed another bug where enemies would not spawn in T-Hunt. This was one that's happened to me countless times. It was really annoying, especially when you're on the defend hostage. You'd be on the last round, one round away from completing that and getting that 250 renown from your daily challenge, and the enemies don't spawn in and you got to start all over again. It was very frustrating. There was also a spot on Cafe where drones could see through all of the walls. This is a first note of drones seeing through walls. There have been countless bugs of this happening. They also fixed a bug where the game would sometimes boot on the central US data center instead of Western Europe, so you can imagine the massive ping problems players affected by this would have had. There was also a couple of glitches where the players would not receive renown after a match, or they could get stuck in an infinite loading lobby if they joined a match in progress. Like with the slow matchmaking times, that one would have also just been a right kicker. And then a couple for PC was that PC players could not aim down sights with Tachanka's turret if they had their aim set to toggle, and also push to talk was completely missing. So yeah, there had been some pretty unfavourable bugs up to this point, but thankfully these were the ones that got fixed. Then on February 11th we got patch 2.1. Now one of the major changes of this patch was they started fixing misaligned optics. So this is where the recoil pattern of the weapon and your reticle displayed in first person are not the same. So under continuous fire, your bullets would not necessarily go where the reticle was pointing, and that was causing a lot of people to not hit headshots where they should have, or perhaps just get really inconsistent feedback. So thankfully they started deploying fixes for this. They also added the feature that all players get notified when a player in-game is banned. That was a good feature. It allows people to know that people are being detected and banned by anti-cheat, because at this point there was a very low confidence in the anti-cheat system. They also reduced Blitz's head exposure behind his shield. Up until this point, you could easily headshot Blitz while he was behind his shield because his head and helmet poked right over the top, which just meant that he was a completely useless character up until this point. They also fixed shields gaining maximum aim down sight accuracy before fully ADS. This would have been really irritating. It kind of reminds me of the Clash glitch we saw when she was first released. They also increased the swing speed of Sledge's hammer, just make him a bit more versatile, which is definitely a good change. And they also made some tweaks to Glaz. They made it so he could now destroy wooden barricades. There wasn't any extra detail in this in the notes, so I don't know if it was a case that he actually could not destroy barricades at all, or it just took an obscene amount of bullets. But that was one thing that they noted. They also made it in this patch that Glaz can destroy castle barricades in 4 shots. This gave him a fairly useful bit of utility, even though at this point in the game he wasn't a good operator. But it actually seemed to take the community a while to actually catch on to this and realise he could do this, mostly because his pick rate was just so low. They also increased the range that players can make pings. So this is the yellow icon when you want to let your teammates know where something is. The range of that was increased. I think that's a really good change for communication. And they also removed the automatic vote kick when someone team kills or kills the hostage. This was just to reduce initial toxicity after a team kill, because there are so many times when someone runs across your sights as you're firing and they are unwilling to take the blame. So people would instantly click, yes, I want that person out of the game, and the whole team would jump on the bandwagon. So people would get vote kicked when it wasn't necessary. And for the notable bug fixes in this patch, some people had headshot hits not registering properly. Also, Kapkan's lasers sometimes became invisible, so thankfully that became fixed, because at this point Kapkan could one-shot kill if you went through one of his traps. Bandit could also duplicate his batteries, was one of the weird bugs. I imagine that would be very annoying for a Thatcher player. And also, players were sometimes clipping into walls using deployable shields. This was the first occurrence of this bug, which has come back in many forms since. They also fixed headshot hitboxes for Buck and Frost. Because of their high collars on their clothing, it would mean that if you could land a headshot, but if it touched the collar, it would count as body damage. Blitz's shield also sometimes would blind players not facing it, which would have been really irritating to play against. And there was also a bug where if you placed Frost's welcome mat onto a hatch and then reinforced it, now I can't confirm whether the welcome mat would activate and it could actually trap someone through a reinforcement, but I can imagine that would be frustrating if that was the case. They also fixed a couple of reloading related bugs where people get into an infinite reload animation or just not able to reload at all. There was also a slightly amusing bug where you would get the jamming effect on your screen. So when you drive your drone into a mute jammer, you'd get that effect on your first person screen if you are holding a drone in your hands whilst in the area of effect of a mute jammer. I can imagine that was quite annoying, but it's quite funny to read back. They also fixed a bug where the diffuser could not be disabled if the planter dies as they finish planting. Also, castle barricades were not always displaying correctly for all players. Castle would see them, but other players wouldn't, so some players would just basically get a free wall hack out of that. Also, the windows on Yacht were completely opaque when playing Monty. The windows were just completely black, so Monty, unfortunately, was not having a good time on this boat. And also, players were vaulting inside the ceiling on Yacht, which was a very annoying bug. But my personal favourite bug from this entire patch is that players would fall through the map if they were deploying Kapkan's EDD in the basement of Clubhouse. Like, that must have been so frustrating to play. You're just trying to catch the enemies off guard with your traps, and you fall straight through the map. Like, it must have been frustrating, but it is quite funny to read back. There was also a brick wall which could be shot through an Oregon. This was a first note of indestructible surfaces being shot through. This has come back in many patches, as well as drones going out of the maps, as well as through walls. This one has come back so many times. There's just weird little spots or objects that drones for some reason can pass through. Also, another first note was nitrocells sticking to plant leaves and just small collision problems with this gadget. It was often there's a small object which has a physical barrier, and the nitrocell would just stick to it. So they made it in this patch that they wouldn't go through leaves, and in many subsequent patches they fixed this for other objects on the maps. They also fixed a bug where players could join a ranked match that's already in progress. Like, if you were the winning team and the other team was quitting and then all of a sudden you get some higher ranked players jump into your game, that would be very frustrating. Also, they fixed a very intrusive bug where players could see through walls whilst using NVIDIA SLIs. This is a PC only one, but for certain hardware and software configurations you could just see through walls, which thankfully they fixed that in this update. A couple of other smaller and less notable changes. They changed the recoil on the AUG for the PC and also for the PKP, which is the Spetsnaz LMG. which was then done for all platforms. They also made it so that daily challenges would be reset without needing to log in. So previously you had to log in to get your new daily challenges. They also added the ESL HUD preset, so this would just be for the Pro League live streams, and they also added dedicated server for custom games, but this was under the condition that the custom game had at least 10 players in at all times. Then on March 1st we got patch 2.2. This made some really important changes. One of them was that the report player button was added. This was a really good one for detecting cheaters and also griefers as well. They also removed 19 instant spawn kill locations on multiple maps. I'll have the pictures up here on screen which were featured in the patch notes, but these were just locations where the defenders could instantly kill the attackers as soon as they spawned. So these were really horrible spots, but thankfully they started fixing these, which then meant they were no longer as much of a problem. A couple of really important changes in Ranked was they enabled kill cams. This was mostly to help cheater detection so you could work out was a player behaving suspiciously, and they also improved the match ranking to reduce varying skill teams. They didn't add any specific details on the ranks or the MMR boundaries, but it was just to make it a more competitive experience. Then for the notable bug fixes in this patch, there was one bug where the operators would get stuck in a T-pose without any textures. This probably wouldn't have had a massive effect on gameplay, but it might have been quite funny to look at. There was also a bug where attackers were not receiving damage whilst repelling using a drone. That must have been pretty horrible as a defender if you catch a repelling attacker off guard, and then this bug prevents you getting the kill. A slightly less intrusive one was that players would sometimes not take foot damage. I can understand this maybe having a bit more of an impact at higher levels where players use very tight angles, and so this was a useful but not necessarily majorly impactful change. They also improved hit registration for defenders trying to shoot the player escorting the hostage. Unfortunately, I don't have any extra details about what the problems were, but thankfully this made the hostage game mode a little bit less punishing for defenders. There was also a bug where weapons would sometimes appear through walls. I'm not sure if this is the weapons separate from the character, or whether it was actually a live operator's weapon would clip through a wall, revealing their location. Also, sometimes drones would fly out of the map when thrown. Clearly, a lot of the operators took great inspiration from Kobe Bryant, and ground gadgets couldn't be placed on top of barricade debris. I'll admit it's very situational, but if your teammate drags down a barricade and it stops you placing your gadget, that would have been rather frustrating. This patch also saw the first fix for a bug where secure area objective boundaries wouldn't fully fill the room. So there were certain positions within the objective room where you just wouldn't contest. So if you were in overtime and you happen to step into one of these areas, you lose the round, and it really did suck. So thankfully they fixed that, and there were many issues of this in other objectives later on down the line. There was also a small gap on Oregon which the attackers could shoot the defenders through. This yet again is the first note of one of these issues. There's always just like small cracks and small tiny little gaps which players found that they could shoot through, which led to really unbalanced gameplay between the two sides. Also on Shally there was an invisible collision blocking all damage. That would have been very frustrating to play against. You can see a player and just neither of you can deal damage to each other. On House there were players falling through the map when they repelled near the river docks. That would have been situationally annoying, but also it's quite amusing to read back. Also the pillows had no collisions with gadgets. In the one hand that's not a huge bug, but at the same time I can understand it would be annoying if players were able to just hide their gadgets within the pillows. Especially for instance later on if you had a Valkyrie camera in there, people would not be able to see it. But thankfully that was fixed prior to her addition. And then on Cafe, the bottom of the dining hall wall could not be vaulted over once the top of the wall had been destroyed. Then the final couple of bugs was that they made various fixes to spectator cameras, as well as fixing the PlayStation 4 Players Met feature, because up until this point it just wasn't working at all. And then on March 30th we got the final patch of Operation Black Ice, patch 2.3. This brought the much needed nerf to the Super 90, which at this point was basically a hip-fire sniper rifle, so they reduced its fall-off damage. They also increased the destruction caused by Buck's skeleton key when shot into soft walls. I'll have the footage of that shown on screen. This was just to make him a more viable operator because they never intended the shotgun to be used lethally. It was mostly intended for destruction. They also increased the SMG-11 recoil. At this point this gun had access to the ACOG scope, and so it was an absolute monster. They also removed 3 more instant spawn kill locations on Yacht and Bank, and also they made netcode changes to favour low ping players, and this was a big change to improve player experience. They also made more changes to the rank playlist. Matches must start with 10 players now, so you wouldn't end up with unbalanced teams. They also made many fixes to reconnection. This was usually caused by PC players using certain key combinations in certain menus. And they also increased the quitting penalties. They also added skill matching in casual. Now, before anyone gets upset about this, what they detailed was that it does have an exponential decrease in the skill criterion. So whilst at the very beginning of the matchmaking it would look for a relatively equally skilled player, it exponentially decreases the longer the matchmaking time continued. And at this point in the game, matchmaking times were still quite long. They also added reconnecting in custom matches. For most players this won't be an issue, but I can imagine it definitely would have helped for Pro League matches. And they also added temporary bans for potential cheaters. Then the notable bug fixes in this patch was that sometimes you get incorrect health points shown in the kill cam. Also, Monty could shoot before fully dropping his shield, so thankfully that one was fixed. And there was also fixes to prevent gaps between wall reinforcements. There was also a bug on Hereford where if the hostage was in the kitchen spawn, they could be killed by the attackers if they opened the hatch above the hostage with a breaching charge. That must have been pretty frustrating for the attacking team. There was also a slightly amusing bug where players would lose all sound effects, but they could hear drone sounds constantly when in first person. That must have been really irritating to play with, but thinking about it, it sounds quite funny. And also the, very importantly, added IP protection to stop players finding others' IP addresses. So as you can see, through this season there's been a lot of changes, a lot of bug fixes, as well as some much needed balance changes. I have to say the Galaxy Brain Fuse bug is my absolute personal favourite from this season, with the Capcan EDD glitch being a close second. But anyway, I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it informative. As always, if you've experienced any of these bugs, or perhaps there was something I didn't include from this season, please feel free to leave that in the comment section down below. I've been the guy from the Gamertag, and I will see you on another video. 1 Op 4